this. And said, here's I think one of the best, my sister-in-law, and it was forwarding a text from a doctor who just moved from Washington State to her community in Texas. Just got Washington State, just got out January the 12th, that'd be tomorrow, an involuntary isolation and quarantine camps for person or groups of persons who do not follow the health guidelines. Scary times. So the listener said, I was trying to find more information and only found this draft agenda. I can't tell what's. And here's where this came from and why they missed the real issue here. This is something that was done by the Gateway Pundit on January the 8th. And then yesterday, InfoWars copied the story. So between the Gateway Pundit and InfoWars, you have what is really a disinformation campaign. Whether it is intentional or whether they just want sensational headlines, you can judge for yourself. But the reality is that Gateway Pundit fixed theirs, so people are still panicking over this. The Gateway Pundit has an update at the end of their article pushing this. I said, and first of all, they talk about, and it is true, what the law says. It does say that they're going to, the reference law has procedures for isolation or quarantine. It would allow local health officers, quote, at his or her sole discretion, unquote, to issue an emergency detention order causing a person or group of persons to be immediately detained for purposes of isolation or quarantine. Now, that is should be very this. Do you realize that that law has been there since 2003? Where did that law come from? It came from the Model State Health Emergency Powers Act. This was model legislation. How many times have I talked about where this all originated? Dark winter, 2 months before them all off. That was a seminal one, and all the rest of these, Event 201 and the rest of these that everybody talks about, those were all patterned on that first simulation, Dark Winter. That's why when Goat Tree told me a couple of years, 2 years since this happened, it was like 2 years or a year and a half before this stuff rolled out. So he said, well, there's a lot of chatter about Dark Winter 2. That's kind of concerning. And now we see what happened with that. But you have the simulation, Dark Winter, 2 months before 9/11. The 9/11 false flag. The week after, you have an anthrax attack. Another false flag inside job done by the CIA. And we pretty much know that. Even the New York Times and Washington Post have pointed out, well, the only suspects, the only people who had that kind of anthrax were the CIA. And when they brought the FBI in to investigate this, they shifted the investigation over to another lab where they didn't have that kind of anthrax. Then they found a person who they hectored who didn't have the capability to do that, and was not. All of his coworkers said that they didn't believe that he did it. He didn't have access to the technology either. But they scapegoated him. And then he was killed or committed suicide a few years ago. And the FBI said, see, we're done. Case closed. Now, the mainstream media, even the New York Times and Washington Post, did not believe that. I've talked to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth. They don't believe it either. They did further investigations. I talked to them a few months ago about all of that. But after that anthrax attack, and oh, by the way, people died, and people died on 9/11. There's no question about any of that stuff. All of this stuff about nobody died. That is just to discredit the people who are looking at the inside job and who benefits from that. But you had the simulation 2 months before. You had the attack a week later. And then 2 months later, Biden and a bunch of these other people put together model legislation for states to enact. Why? Because you have the 9th and 10th Amendment, And because this is going to be run through the states, as it was run through the states with President Trump, with financial encouragement and with, by the emergency declaration, executive order that Trump did 670 days ago. So he gave them the trigger to do this emergency powers that they had given themselves back in 2002, 2003. It took a couple of years. And so Washington State, back in 2003, rolled out this very troubling document. But they did it as part of the response to the false flags of the anthrax attack and the simulation of dark winter. That's what you need to understand. And it is bad. But nobody paid any attention to it until just recently. And then when Gateway Pundit and InfoWars comes in and says this is something new, and they allow these people to come back and say, that's not new. There's nothing happening at this meeting, and you're a bunch of paranoid conspiracy theorists. You see, when you add a false sensational detail to the truth that's been lying there in open view for 20 years, then what you do is you disarm people. You disarm the truth by adding a sensational lie. And I've seen that over and over again from Gateway Pundit and from InfoWars. They are famous for that. They've made a business model out of that. So here's the update. The update says the board is not voting to change isolation or quarantine policies at its meeting tomorrow. Agenda item number 9, while related to rulemaking on Chapter 246-100 WAC, that's the Washington state law reference, is scoped only to the implementation of, again, they reference another law, Chapter 76, the laws of 2020, and does not include changes to isolation and to quarantine policies, nor does it suggest law enforcement be used to enforce any vaccination requirements. For more information, you can check these places. Now, that is the update from the Washington State Board of Health that Gateway Pundit added to the end of their article, not the beginning, which is also kind of suspicious. And then here is where this has been rolling out for a long time. Going back to May of 2020, a guy who was running for Washington State Legislature, he is a lawyer, and he pointed out how bad this law is. And this law was in effect then. Again, this law goes back to 2003, part of the model legislation that was pushed out after their false flag attacks and their inside job attack with the anthrax a week after 9/11. They pushed out this model legislation, and they got it enacted in Washington, and 30 some odd other states have similar stuff. That's what you should be concerned about. The Model State Health Emergency Powers Act. You need to be rescinding that. You need to be working with your state legislatures to rescind that, because that's where they gave themselves the power after dark winter. And they've been practicing to doing this for the last 20 years. And this legislation is something you should be concerned about. But don't add the false details like there's something new that's happening here. It's even more powerful if you give people the history of this, instead of throwing out sensational stuff devoid of any connection to what's going on here. So here's the history of it. Back in May of 2020, as he was running for election, he said, can the governor, through public health officials, involuntarily confine, quarantine Washingtonians? Yes. The public health officials can confine and quarantine Washingtonians who fail to comply with the governor's stay-home order and self-quarantine, according to the Washington Administrative Code. And he quotes that same code. At his or her sole discretion, a local health officer may issue an emergency detention order causing a person or group of persons to be immediately detained for purpose of isolation or quarantine. It authorizes confinement by local health officials, and the Department of Health adopts their administrative code to set the standards and procedures for the voluntary and involuntary confinement and quarantine. The process outlined in WAC 46-100 has been effective since 2003. You can see this in multiple places. This process adopted in 2003. What? After a real attack as a false flag, an inside job, after that happened after a simulation. And a couple of months later, they roll out this model legislation and they put it in there. Orders to confine the quarantined Washingtonians can be brought to a judge ex parte. That means you're not there. There's nobody to represent you. This is a hearing without your presence. It is a hearing without a jury. It is a hearing with only one side of the information there. And that's what this individual, Peter Borno, who was an attorney and a candidate for the State House of Representatives, pointed out. I hope this guy won for your sakes in Washington. We need more people like him. And we need to roll back this model State Health Emergency Powers Act legislation that has been put in more than half of the states, even before this stuff rolled out. So he said, pointed out, you can have voluntary quarantine, you can have involuntary isolation or quarantine. And he points out the difference is that quarantine is for somebody that is suspected of being in contact with somebody who is sick. Isolation is somebody that they verified is sick. Take them off to the confinement camp. He said if the involuntary quarantine is based solely on the local health officer's order for involuntary isolation or quarantine, he said no lawsuit has yet been filed. So the local health jurisdiction can file a lawsuit using the form from Department of Homeland summons and petition for order authorizing continued involuntary detention for quarantine or isolation. They can re-up it for another 30 days if the Superior Court says so. But he says a particular concern is the ex parte order. That alone should raise enormous red flags. This subjective process needs better transparency. It needs checks and balances. If a person is a true threat, then have an open hearing with a notice to get all the facts from both sides before a judicial officer enters an order. And of course, there is a process when you look at this Washington Code, because I did this a lot before, I'm going to call out another organization for, crying wolf. This is a couple of pages, the different aspects governing communicable diseases. And again, the product for a couple of years after they ran their dark winter simulation, 9/11, the anthrax attacks, they put out this model state legislation December of 2001. And for the next couple of years, you've had the legislatures putting that in your state code. So one of these aspects is how you get out. What do you do to get relief from isolation or quarantine? Any person or group of persons detained by order of a local health officer may apply to the court for an order to show cause why the individual or group should not be released. You can apply to the court where a judge will hear your case. You understand how this is operating? You have public health bureaucrats, or maybe the governor, could be a local health department official, could be state. They decide on a criteria, and then locally they finger you. They take your name to a judge in an ex parte hearing where you are not there to defend yourself. There's no examination of evidence. They make their case. It's like a grand jury where you can indict a ham sandwich, except there's no jury. It's just a judge. And so on the basis of that, they lock you up. Now, if you want to get out after you've been there for 10 days, a month, or whatever, you can appeal to a judge and say, please listen to my case again. Are you happy with that kind of process? I'm not. And this is everywhere in the U.S. Now, an update on what is happening, because there have been some changes in Washington over their coronavirus facilities. Back in March 2020, and this is before, remember, the National Emergency Executive Order by Trump 670 days ago. So this is March the 4th. That happened March the 13th. There's an article in Washington State. The governor, Inslee, visited a health emergency operations center before heading to a potential isolation quarantine site in Centralia. Now, this is back in the news just in December, this site in Centralia. They say at a press conference, the governor, Inslee, of Washington State, spoke to Vice President Mike Pence. Said, we've now been given the green light to increase the frequency and protocols under which people can actually be tested, said Governor Inslee. That was a good thing that the federal government, Trump, Pence, gave us the green light. They gave them the green cash, too, right? And then that site, as they point out, that was back in March. They said the site is surrounded by barbed wire fence. It'll include several trailers where patients will be isolated and quarantined. Officials on site at that time, March, the beginning of March 2020, 2 weeks before this emergency executive order. So officials said quarantine is for people who are healthy, but have been exposed, while isolation will be for those who are sick. They said this is the type of facility for someone who doesn't have a home to be in, or maybe they have someone they live with